Hey there, friend. My name's Sarai, and I host a spooky, casual podcast called Freaky AF, where I tell you stories of conspiracies, true crime, and of the supernatural. So if that's your kind of shiz, come check us out. I'm sure we'll be great friends. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, and a bunch of other places. Or you can look us up on Twitter and Instagram. We're Freaky AF Pod. That's FREAKYAFPOD. Come get spooked, y'all.
Hi, listeners. We have a podcast to share with you that you can go binge over 50 episodes right now.
Every Thursday, we bring you a new episode filled with mysteries, conspiracies, and things that go bump in the night.
I'm Holly Lauerman.
And I'm Brooke Sasser.
And we are the hosts of Curly Conspiracies podcast.
The name of our podcast stems from, well, our curly hair, and the idea that conspiracies and mysteries are never straightforward.
They take multiple twists, turns, have-nots, and take a while to comb through.
We have some lighthearted topics such as Eminem is a clone, the Coca-Cola conspiracy, and even the Kentucky meat shower.
Some more serious topics like April is Blood Sacrifice Month, the Johnny Gosh disappearance, and the Nahanni Valley mystery.
We also have your classics like the conspiracies surrounding Princess Diana's death, Mothman, and the Roswell incident.
Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. So, go get your tinfoil hats ready and check out Curly Conspiracies podcast.
Darkcast Network. The light shines brightest on our indie podcasts.
Welcome to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. These episodes address the doomsday clock and the events that keep it ticking down, and the things that we can do to stop it. The doomsday clock has been set at 100 seconds to midnight since 2020. It's 100 seconds to midnight, and the tenuous relationship between Ukraine and Russia has triggered another war. For many years after independence from Russia was declared in 1991, Ukrainian leaders had sought to become a part of the European Union. In November of 2013, President Viktor Yanukovych announced that his administration had tabled that effort. On November 21st of that year, Yanukovych made an abrupt announcement that Ukraine would suspend trade and association negotiations with the European Union after several years of continuing talks. He announced that Ukraine would not sign the association agreement that was scheduled to be signed at an EU-Ukraine summit in Lithuania later that year. Instead, he accepted a $15 billion bailout from Moscow. Yanukovych said that Ukraine would begin negotiations with Russia about joining the Eurasian Customs Union. It was known that these decisions were made under pressure from the Russian government. Russia wanted Ukraine to join forces with them, just as they had in the past. Vladimir Putin had taken office in 2012, and one of the first things he did was announce a plan to restore the Russian economy that had been failing since the fall of the Russian government in 1991. Part of that declaration was a renewed relationship with Ukraine, whether Ukraine wanted it or not. Yanukovych's decision to sever ties with the UN in favor of increasing ties to Russia resulted in 3 months of street protest in Kyiv's independent square known as Maidan. These began as pro-West rallies, but ended in all-out protests against Yanukovych and his government. These protests were eventually met with force from the opposition, and more than 100 people died. On February 21st of 2014, Yanukovych signed an EU-mediated peace pact that included plans for presidential elections before the end of the year. The following day, Ukraine's parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from power, and Yanukovych fled Ukraine, claiming that he was the target of a coup. Shortly after, he was indicted for mass murder in the deaths of the demonstrators of the Maidan protests. Moscow refused to deal with the Ukrainian parliament, saying that they were leaders of an armed mutiny against Yanukovych. Ukraine's acting president, Alexander Turchinov, claimed that his goal was to bring Ukraine closer to a deal with Europe. From the end of February to the beginning of March 2014, Russian forces took over Crimea. Crimea is a Ukrainian peninsula where mostly ethnic Russians reside. Europe and the U.S. condemned the takeover, but the pro-Russian authorities in Crimea held an election to settle the dispute. Voters in Crimea chose to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. The legitimacy of the election has been questioned since. Brussels said that the election was illegal and illegitimate, and Washington said that they would never accept Crimea as a part of Russia. On March 21, 2014, Russia announced the reunification of Crimea. The UN General Assembly voted 100 to 11 against recognizing Crimea as a part of Russia. Russia was then expelled from the G8. Putin later claimed that Russian soldiers were sent to Crimea to protect ethnic Russians from violence that was coming from Ukraine under orders from Kyiv. In April of 2014, armed pro-Russian separatist groups seized government buildings across the Donbas region of Ukraine. These separatist groups claim to be independent of the Russian government. This region is home to the steel smelters and large plants that produce a third of Ukraine's industrial products. Ukraine resisted, but Russia had built up an army along the border, and Ukraine was afraid of starting a much bigger war. The West imposed sanctions on Russia, hoping to quell the tensions, but it didn't work. The war in the Donbas continues, and as of 2021, more than 14,000 people have been killed in the fighting. About a quarter of these have been civilians. Approximately 1.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced from the Donbas. In May of 2014, Petro Poroshenko had won the majority in the first round of Ukrainian presidential elections. Poroshenko was a pro-West businessman and oligarch who had promised to repair the economy in Ukraine by aligning it with Europe. He promised to end the war with the separatists in the East and negotiate a stable relationship with Moscow in order to return the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine. President Barack Obama said that his administration would help Poroshenko fight corruption, and Vice President Joe Biden was assigned as chief envoy to Ukraine. On July 17, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over Ukraine. The plane was hit with a surface-to-air missile fired by pro-Russian rebels that had been fighting with the Ukrainian government troops. 298 people were on board the flight, and most of them were Dutch nationals. All of them perished. A Dutch-led international investigation team collected evidence for years, and they proved that the missile launcher used to hit the plane came from a Russian army base directly across the border. Russia denied any responsibility for the crash. In September of 2014, Ukraine was on the verge of regaining control of the Donbas. Russian troops and heavy artillery were sent in to push the Ukrainian army back. Negotiations began in Belarus aimed at ending the war. The first Minsk agreement was signed, but its terms had never been implemented. There was a very short ceasefire, but then the fighting continued. The following year, Putin met with Poroshenko in Minsk to negotiate another ceasefire. President François Hollande of France and Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany mediated the negotiations. The agreement outlined 13 steps to end the war. These included an immediate ceasefire in Donetsk and Luhansk, withdrawal of all heavy equipment, and the creation of a security zone in that region. Another part of the agreement stated that local elections be held in Donbass. On July 11, 2017, Ukraine entered into an association agreement with the European Union. This agreement promoted deeper political ties, stronger economic links, and respect for common values between the EU and Ukraine. The economic part of the agreement was the strengthening of free trade between the EU and Ukraine. Free trade with the Europeans would modernize Ukraine's economy. The agreement would begin on September 1, 2017. That same month, Vladimir Putin had told the U.S. that any attempt to provide defensive weapons to Ukraine would only fuel the conflict in eastern Ukraine and would possibly push the separatists to expand the campaign there. The Obama administration had only agreed to help Ukraine fight the war with non-lethal military assistance. But in December of 2017, the Trump administration approved lethal arms sales to Ukraine. The sale was estimated to be worth $41.5 million and included sniper rifles, ammunition, and other parts and materials. On May 15, 2018, the Otta section of the road and rail bridge was unveiled. This bridge formed a link between Russia and the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine declared the bridge as a disregard for international law. The bridge drew condemnation from the West also. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said, quote, "It is particularly cynical that its opening is happening on the eve of the latest anniversary of the deportation of the Crimean Tatar people by the Stalin regime," end quote. On January 5, 2019, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople severed the Russian Orthodox Church from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church by formally recognizing its independence. The Russian Orthodox Church had overseen the Ukrainian Church for more than 4 centuries. This split became key in Ukraine's upcoming presidential election to be held on March 31st. Incumbent President Poroshenko used the independence from the Russian Church as the talking point during his election campaign. Russia accused the U.S. of encouraging the split to weaken Moscow. Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president on April 21, 2019. He won by a landslide with more than 70% of the vote. Zelensky was a popular television actor, comedian, and millionaire. He was sworn in that May. He ran on the Servant of the People ticket. His party also won the majority of seats in early parliamentary elections in July of that year, making this the first time since their independence that the president had a majority party in parliament. While many saw this election more as voting Poroshenko out than voting Zelensky in, Zelensky promised to renew peace talks in the East and end corruption and poverty in Ukraine. On September 7, 2019, Russia and Ukraine swapped dozens of war prisoners that had been captured by both sides in the fighting in Crimea and the Donbass. This was seen by the West as a positive sign that very possibly relations between Ukraine and Russia would become less tense. Among the prisoners returned to Russia was Volodymyr Semak, who was suspected of being involved with the missile strike that took down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 in 2014. This brings us to the present. During 2021, the fighting escalated between Ukraine and Russia in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces were beginning to gather along the borders, causing concern that Russia would invade Ukraine again. U.S. President Joe Biden issued a warning in January 2022, saying as much. Moscow claimed to be worried about its security, and the U.S., UK, and other Western powers offered military aid to Kyiv while French President Emmanuel Macron sat in as mediator.